Okay, so welcome. We're going to tonight spend a little bit of time just kind of opening up the conversation. If you have something you're working on, you want to quickly show everybody and talk about, let's do that for a few minutes. Then we're going to switch gears, and John has prepared a number of slides on painting, in particular painting the face. And so he's gonna talk about that. Again, a really important aspect of caricature carving. We've always been saying of a caricature carving, the head and face are actually the most important part of the carving. Painting that is really important, obviously. So John's going to cover that. And then following that, I'm going to pick up on where we left off on the little musician, little cowgirl fiddle player. And I'll take you right through the detailing of that and the painting of that. And I've just brought a number of slides that you'll see in a minute, and I'll just talk to you about how I went about painting it. And then we'll finish up with sort of tips and tricks and techniques, and John has some thoughts on that. But if you have some tips you'd like to offer up at the end of the meeting, we'll have a little bit of time for you to talk about those as well, okay? So if that sounds good to everybody, let me just kind of open it up. If anybody has a carving they're working on that they'd like to just hold up to the camera or talk about something you're working on, that'd be a great start to the meeting. So I'll just leave it to you guys. And I see Roger's popped something up already. Go ahead, Roger.
Hi, am I on?
You're on.
Okay. Yeah, I have the imagination that many of you do in terms of using wire and clay. But what I do is I go on to Pinterest to get ideas and copy things that I can find there. The biggest problem I find is, of course, mainly you only get the frontal view. And I have some difficulty figuring out what the depths are. And I went on Amazon and I bought this little multi-pose statue that you can bend in just about any direction you want. And that helps me get the ideas of where I want arms and legs and sort of the dimensions sorted out. So I've been quite happy with that. And as I said, I started this on Wednesday morning and started carving this off of a Pinterest site. And it's supposed to be, eventually it'll be a man bending over a table to be met by a nurse with a large pill and plunger. So that's all I've got to say. Is it's, as I say, I found this little statue an ideal way to get stuff sorted out for proportions, at least to start, and figure out how a hands, and it has different hand grips you can use and stick in. So it's been quite helpful for me as I venture forth in caricature carving. That's all I have.
That's a good tip.
Mm-hmm. Most of us are of the age now that we're seeing too much in nurses, so none of us want to know what that plunger is going to be used for, Roger.
That's the nurse here. So I don't know if you can
Nice.
see, but she's got a the plunger, and the pill is right there. Oops, just hit the floor. And I'm trying to get a beehive shape to her hairdo to turn that into a beehive. So that's all I have.
Nice job.
Anybody else got anything they would like to share? Okay, let's go to the
Maybe
share
just ask
screen then.
Christine, if you could hold the piece up that you were showing us earlier, so it's on the video. And talk about it. You got to say something though.
Oh, well, I stopped carving. I started carving in 1994, and I stopped about 10 years ago and took up stitching instead. But then I started making little gnomes and out of socks and face cloths and things like that. And I always kept getting the Woodcarvers Illustrated magazine. And 2 issues ago, there was an article on making gnomes. And so I had the cutout done. And then last issue, the last issue that came up, had little easier looking gnomes carved. So I took up my knives again and started carving. So that's what I've been up to. Here's the last one I did, the little part of the hat back there that holds it on the head. And that's what I've been up to lately.
Those are excellent.
Yeah, those look really good.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to do a little share screen here and see if we can't get this working. Hopefully everybody can see that. John, can you see that okay?
Yep, no problem. Yep.
Okay, so just a reminder, when I'm looking at my screen, I see five people right now, and there's bars above those pictures that allows me to choose 1, 2, 3, 4 different views of this. And so if I choose one of the lower ones, I see fewer people. Now I just see John as an example. So play with that a little bit as we go through this so that you're able to see the full presentation chart. Okay. So again, welcome. We'll open for questions or comments. John's going to talk about painting technique. I'm going to follow up with a little bit of final detail in painting, and then we're going to go through tips, chips, and tricks. Now, as I'm speaking, are you able to see me against this chart?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, great. All right, John. So why don't you you get started? And again, we're talking about painting techniques, and John's put together presentation in regard to painting the face.
Okay. I did this little face. It's 2 inch. I think it's by 3 inches long. It's the horizontal cut. It's only like just a face, the half of the 2 by 2. Anyway, this is where I clean up all the burrs and everything, make sure there's no burrs on the carving, and then I clean it up and get ready for paint. And then I put I always paint the eyes before I put I have do the skin flesh tone, so I use an oil, and so I paint the eyes and the teeth and the hair and everything. I painted it all before I put the oil on the face.
And John, when you say you prepare this prior to painting, there's no sealer on this.
No sealer, just preparing by cleaning all the burrs off and make sure that it's nice and clean, nice clean cuts.
John, did you sand it?
No, I never sand it. When talk about sanding for a second, if you sand something, you're going to have a little bit of sand grit on your carving, and if you put a knife to it, you're going to dull your knife really quick. So if you ever do sand any carving, make sure you're done all with your knife, because you're going to dull your knife really quick, because it leaves a little bit of trace sand on your carving. It embeds it in your carving.
John, do you ever use a wood burning tool prior to painting a head, or do you just always go like this?
I always do that. I not too often do it on the face.
Okay.
I use it on the body, but not too often on the face. I'll show you what I do to get that same tint. So right here it is, all painted up, ready for a skin tone. I put a highlight, like the blonde hair, the reddish blonde hair first. Then I put inside the cracks of the hair, I put a darker color. These are all light washes. So this might be like 3 times I go over this until I find the color that I want. So it's really light wash. It's not dark enough. I put another wash on it, another wash. I don't want to go really opaque really quick, and then I don't like it, and then I gotta cut it off or try to strip it off somehow. So I always go 3 coats at least of the lighter color, then put some darker color inside the cracks where the hair is.
John, can you explain your wash?
It's usually, just a thinned out wash acrylic paint.
How much water?
It's Pardon me?
How much water do you put in?
I don't really measure. I just look at it. So I see some people say like 10 drops of water to 2 drops of paint or whatever. It's just really thin paint, and I just apply it, and it's not dark enough. I apply another coat. I just keep on applying until I get my successful with the color I want.
Okay.
So it's just light washes.
Is that paint acrylic?
Yeah, it's acrylic paint. Yeah.
John, what kind of brush do you use for the eyes?
I went to Michael's and bought a bunch of brushes. Artist Loft brushes. I don't really have any specific brands I like. I like smaller brushes. So I went to Michael's and bought a bunch of brushes. Artist Loft is one I got there.
John, did you talk about the mouth and the teeth yet?
Yeah, I just anything white I paint. I put that on first, and inside the mouth I have it's red where the tongue is, but inside I make it a little darker for a shadow, like on the top part. So underneath is red, and then I wash a dark on top of that, to make a shadow. And then I put the oil, the Min Wax oil, the 209, natural 209, and I put an inch and a half of oil paint inside that, and I mix it up, and that gives me my skin tone. And I go over the whole thing, over the eyes, the teeth. Well, on the last picture, you didn't see I carved the teeth a little bit, put a little slits where the teeth were, but the next one has the teeth separated. And
Could you go over that? Could you go over that natural? You mix natural Min Wax with what?
with 209 burnt sienna. 209 natural Min Wax stain, and an inch of burnt sienna oil paint, artist oil paint.
Okay.
And I mix that up, and that's the skin tone that I get.
Now, John, you were mentioning to us before that you don't have to use the whole can. If you use a portion of that stain, you just add enough of the burnt sienna. Did you say burnt sienna or burnt umber?
Burnt sienna.
Burnt sienna, you just add enough to the burnt sienna until you're happy with the skin tone, right?
Yeah, I put it all in the whole can.
Yeah.
I take an inch, I stir it up, and I test it on a blank piece of wood, and then I add a little more until I get the skin tone that I like. So then I go over the whole thing, the teeth, the eyes, everything with that oil. And then I put the red in for the nose. It's a wash. The nose, the cheeks, the ears, the top of the ears. That's all done with a light wash. That's probably it's more like a dry brush. So you might want to like 20 drops of water with a dab of red. The red is so powerful, it'll really, you don't want them to look like a clown. So you want to just have red cheeks and a red nose and red ears. So it's very, very little paint. And you can always apply more. So, you put it on too thick, then you got to cut it all off. It's a light wash.
John
And
Paul.
then now I put black. I do a light wash of black in all the cracks, like the cheek, the highlight the cheeks, underneath the cheek, the bags underneath the eyes, the hairline. That's all darkened inside there. Underneath the lip, the bottom of the lip, the smile line, the inside the ears. I put it's a wash, but it's a light wash. It's another 20-to-1 type thing. You can always add more, but you can't take away. So I put very light dry wash underneath there to emphasize all the cheeks and the wrinkles, and if there's hair that needs to be more emphasized, I put a little black in there. But it's really light.
John.
Richard had a question.
Yep.
I have a question.
Yep.
Is there a problem with applying acrylic over top of the oil?
Nope, not at all. Nope. Not at all. Because it absorbs really quick. It dries within a couple of minutes, say 5 minutes. So I put that red right on top of that oil, no problem whatsoever. And then I put the Howard feed wax on it. You can use a natural acrylics, whatever you want, or I like using the Howard feed and wax. I put it on and that, and it puts a nice glitter on, nice shine. And
Could you tell me that Howard, what kind of wax?
Howard feed and wax. You get it at
If John, if you could just hold that up to your camera and hold it still.
can you see it? I can't see what I'm. I should have taken a picture of that, eh, Mark, and put it in.
No, that's good. No, we can see it really well there.
Oh, you can see it? Okay.
Yeah, very well.
Okay. I can't see what you're seeing.
Yeah, and I think you were going to say you can get it at Home Hardware.
Home Hardware, yes.
Yeah.
And then you put it over
I
top.
didn't- I was actually at Home Hardware this afternoon about 2 hours ago. You must have bought their last bottle, Mark, because they don't have any in stock in the store, and they don't have any in their warehouse.
Oh, wow.
Really? You see, people are watching these videos on YouTube, and
Yeah.
John and I have shares in Howard's Feed and Wax.
We put the run on them.
Don't be surprised if I come over with a cup of Howard's tomorrow.
You're welcome anytime. I was telling Roger and Fred both about this Howard's Feed and Wax this week, just the other day. I told them the good news, it goes a long way. Like you have an ounce of the stuff is it's $1 an ounce, and it'll last forever. The bad news is it only comes in 16-ounce containers.
Yeah, so then you put that on there and you rub it on and let it sit for a minute. Then you take the wax off, like you polish it a bit, and that's what it turns out to be. Now, that wasn't a very good piece of wood. It had a big crack in it, and a crack on his lip. It looks like he got ended up being a crack in the wood, but
He was in a fight.
he got in a fight, lost his teeth.
Yeah.
But that's how I do that. How I do the face, paint the face. Any questions?
Can you do touch-ups over that wax, John?
I've never tried it. I don't think you could.
Okay.
It's
You probably have to clean
interesting.
that whole section off probably to
Yeah.
get underneath the wax.
It's interesting how that wax acts just like polyurethane does on acrylic paints. It really brightens the colors.
It really, yeah.
It immediately brightens the colors. Yeah. Okay, John, thank you very much. Any last questions for John before we move on? Okay, thanks, John. That was really good.
Okay.
All right, so what we'll do is pick up on the little musician that I was creating with the fiddle, and I'll just give you a little review where we've been. So you'll recall that we started with the head, and the first thing you do once you do a really nice head is you lop off the top so that you can fit a hat. And the fitting of the hat required you to make an outline of the head itself, and then start building the hat. And you remember the hat was made into two parts: the crown portion and the brim portion. And both parts were set on a dowel, and you can just see the end of the dowel here. The dowel goes into the head. You can see the crown in the back here, and the dowel extends up into the crown of the hat. And the idea behind that is that you use graphite or some kind of pastel, and you mark the whole area where the brim and the crown mate. You put the crown on the brim, as you see here, move it around a little bit. And when you remove the crown, the high points here will be transferred onto the bottom of the crown, and you carve those away. And you keep doing that until you get a nice seam, everything fits in nicely. And that's particularly important between the crown and the brim, because of course the brim has got a nice concave shape to it, and you're trying to match that as closely as you can to the crown, or the brim to the crown. Okay, and so that's what we did there. Similarly, you'll recall underneath the brim to the head did exactly the same thing. So we graphited or pasteled the top of the head. The dowel positioned the brim now onto the head. The graphite was transferred to the brim, and you carved away that so that the whole hat now sat well onto the carving's head. Okay, so that's how we did that. You'll also recall that I talked about using clay. And so don't, you know, as it was indicated earlier, Roger was talking about not necessarily using clay for the carving. He did. Not all carvings require clay. If you have a real good understanding of what the figure is going to look like, you really don't need a clay 3D model. For this one, I wanted the clay model because although I had a picture in my mind and a little sketch around what this musician would look like, the position of the body itself, I wanted to make sure I got it really right. And so I made a armature first out of copper wire. And you can see here, this is just household copper wire. For the spine and for the legs, I twined two pieces together. For the arms and shoulders, it's just a single strand of wire. The whole thing was soldered together. So it was soldered at this joint, the shoulder neck joint and the hip joint, just to give it some rigidity and strength as I built this. You can see that it's lying on a pattern that I found, just as Roger did, going to Pinterest and finding a pattern that I would use for a model's figure of a female. And so this gave me the right dimensions. I was able to take those dimensions now, and I was able to mark with a marker exactly where the elbows would be, exactly where the knees would be, exactly where the ankles would be, and start to position that wire model in the manner that I felt at the time the model would look like, or my carving would look like. Now it's holding a Sharpie because my original intent was to have her holding a banjo, which I changed down the road, as you know. But this is the model that I built now, clay around it, by just putting little pieces of clay all around this copper wire. I was able to build a model, and this is the model that came out. And so it's a quick process. It doesn't take very much time. Even though it looks like a lot of detail here, it's by far less than a day's work to develop this kind of model. The point that I was trying to make with everyone here is that because the clay is pliable, regardless of the type of clay you decide to use, because it is pliable, you can move the whole sculpture. And so whereas I had this sculpture fairly standing straight up and down holding a banjo, just by taking the shoulders and moving the right shoulder back and the left shoulder forward, by moving the hip out to the left, it gave this carving a lot more movement and interest, really. And that's the value of using a clay model. You can play with it a little bit, get exactly the position you want, and then start taking pictures of it. And that now becomes your 3D model to model your carving. Okay. And then with that, I did take pictures of this. And so this is just a cutting out a printed version of one of the photos that I took. I transferred that to a piece of wood, and I was able to bring that to the bandsaw and cut that out. You'll recall that I would keep these side pieces, glue them back onto the side, turn the whole thing 90 degrees, and then on this side, draw in the side view of the photograph that I took, a cutout of the photograph, printed photograph on the side, put it back on the bandsaw, and cut out that piece. And then I ended up with the 3D. I'm sorry, I ended up with the model without the arms, because I wanted to add the arms separately because of their size and how fragile they'd be. But I ended up with this as I came off the bandsaw. You recall that John and I have talked a lot about the real key thing to remember when you're doing a caricature or any full figured carving is you want everything round. You don't want anything square. So I put the center line of the front of her legs here. I put the side of her line, or her legs rather, the center line there. And I made sure I carved from this point all the way to that point with no flat sections in between. So this would be perfectly round. When I rough out, I talked to you guys about the fact that I typically use a Fordham tool, and a Fordham tool being a version of a Dremel tool. It happens to have a cable, a handheld piece that's attached by a flexible cable to the motor. I use a very aggressive bit on it for roughing out called a Typhoon bit, which is a bunch of sharp little carbide bits on a shape. And I talked to you about the safety precautions you need to take to do that. As aggressive as this bit is in taking wood away, this happens very quickly. And if you touch your hand, you're in trouble, or any part of your body. So I really suit up for it. It's dusty. You want to wear dust masks. You want to have safety glasses on. You want to have your leather apron on. You want your arms protected. You want your hands protected. Okay. And then from there, the next step that we talked about the last time we were together is you're starting to detail. So I've got that kind of very rough shape done with the Typhoon bit. And now you start thinking, you're looking at your clay model a little bit. You're looking at the pictures of the clay model you took. You might be looking at Pinterest pictures of, this was going to be a cowgirl or a female country musician. So I looked at what does a more modern country musician wear these days? And so I started thinking, okay, I'm going to want her to have jeans on. I'm going to want her to have a blouse on, a big belt. I could picture a vest, a kerchief, kind of a cowboy's type kerchief. So I started carving that in detail now using knives and gouges. Wanted to make sure I got some real nice contours here. I didn't want the vest just to drape straight down. So you can see there's really nice contours in here, all undercut. I mentioned to you, talking to my daughter, she said, oh, it needs a fringe. So I cut in a fringe here and later came back and cut in the individual fringe sections here. You might recall that, again, you could have just draped this fringe straight down and been very happy with it. But I thought it would look a lot nicer if it kind of undulated. There were waves in it, in and out. So I just took a gouge and I gouged in a little valley there and a little valley there and another one there. And then when you actually added the lines, it looked like the individual fringe elements kind of waved back and forth. Added in a kerchief, so it doesn't take a whole lot to carving to add in the kerchief. One of the things that you recall I mentioned to you last time is that you can put in the simple lines for the kerchief showing two pieces of the kerchief, but here I used a gouge to just show another contour. So you can see gouge marks that show that the kerchief is in fact fabric and it's kind of waving in and out. Okay, and a little knot here again, just a few knife marks to make the knot. Okay. From there, I eventually decided that instead of a banjo, she was going to be playing a fiddle. And so again, back to Google search and Pinterest and found pictures of fiddle, and I scaled it to the size of the carving that I was trying to make. And I actually made this particular fiddle out of maple, a piece of maple. I wanted it a little bit stronger because I could see it as sort of a structural member of the carving, because I knew that her hand would be extended to one end and the other end would be under her chin. So I wanted something strong there. I probably overdid it, but I decided to use maple, and it wasn't hard to carve out of maple. And, really pretty simple design. Made sure you put the little F holes in there. I carved this section out. You can see I used a burning tool to delineate sort of the different pieces of wood involved in a fiddle, and made sure that that was carved out to show a little bit of concave contour inside between the two laminated upper and lower, upper and front of the violin. From there, we talked quite a bit about arms, and we've talked quite a bit about actually adding arms as a group over the last year or so. This is a process that I prefer to use unless I know that the carving is going to be a figure with arms straight down or attached to the legs in some fashion. If the arms are out in the air, I like to make sure that the grain of the wood is going in the direction that gives you the greatest strength. And so you can see in this case, as an example, if I had just carved that as part of the body where the grain is going in this direction in the body, the grain would have gone in this direction in the elbow, and that would have been vulnerable to being broken off. This would have fared a little bit better only because it's going down in this direction, perhaps until you get to about the elbow. And so I try to create in these grain direction that's going to be best for strength. Same process used, adding a dowel here into one section, make sure there's a hole for the dowel here. You can see how I marked off here. Every time I removed the arm from the body, I knew I was placing it back in the same spot because I'd have those pencil marks lined up. And the reason that was important to me is because I then took that graphite or a pastel, if you're using that, and I colored all this surface in, put the arm in like this, wiggled it just a little bit, pulled the arm off again, and then anywhere that graphite was transferred here, I knew it was a high spot. I'd take that away, do that several times, maybe 5 or 6 times, and you get a nice tight joint. You'll also remember that I talked to you about is really important that this isn't the end of the deal of the arm. Nobody has an arm, maybe Arnold Schwarzenegger has an arm that goes down like this and then a great big bump there, a muscular bump. The rest of us, our shoulders slope straight down the arm or straight down to the outside of the arm. And so all of that, it'd have to be carved away as well. We'll see that in the later pictures. Okay, talked about the hands. So again, the hands are really important. Go to Pinterest, Google search hands. You'll get all kinds of artists' drawings of hands. This hand I just picked up as an example for you. The artist here actually left out this knuckle here that would come actually across here, but that's okay. The point I was trying to make with everyone is that when you're roughing in a hand, it's really planes on the hand. You're not doing the individual fingers first, but you can see that there's a rectangle right here that's on a different angle than the rectangle up here. And there's a rectangle, if you want, down here that's on a different plane or angle than this. And you can see it in my hand as well. So here's one plane, here's another plane. And the other thing I remember mentioning to you that's important to me is that your best model for a hand is your hand. So, if you know that the hand has to be in a certain position on your caricature carving, put your hand in that position and take a good look at it and then go back to carving. Just keep going back and forth. I do that all the time. And it helps me develop, first of all, that roughing in planes and then where the fingers have to be divided. So in this picture as an example, you can see I've done quite a bit of detail on this hand, and that was looking at my own hand and how it would look if I were to be holding a violin out like that. And then I got it to the point after doing all of the roughed in planes of putting the individual fingers in. And here you can see where she's going to be holding the bow. The bow is going to stretch up to here. You can see I've just started to pencil in those planes, and I'm going to flatten those out first. The first knuckle down a bit, second set of knuckles or fingers between knuckles is on a different plane, and then the back of her hand here. And that's where we ended up last time, I think. So that's what it looked like where we left off last time. So there's quite a bit of detail there. You can see I've gone over some of it with a wood burning tool. I got the head pointed in the direction that I wanted to see it pointed. You know, in terms of looking down the violin and down towards the ground a little bit. I got the hands pretty nicely where I wanted them. One hand kind of dished up, holding the bow, the other hand with one finger here on the neck of the violin. You can see here just slightly, the thing I was telling you earlier is all of that big bulb that I had on top of this arm is now gone. It's just completely a gradual curve right up to her shirt collar, really. Okay. What else would I tell you about this? I think that's about what I the other thing I told you, don't do this, but I used a hot glue gun to just do things like position the violin, put a little bit of hot glue under her chin, you can see some right there. That was a bloody mess. I'd never do that again in a million years. That hot glue was like trying to take gum off a chair. It was horrible. So don't use that. Use another method. Pinch it together with small clamps, or maybe a tiny drop of white glue would do it, or just tape. But my hot glue idea was not something I'll repeat. Okay, folks, do you remember all that? Everybody okay with that?
Quiet crowd.
Yeah, any questions at all?
Yes, Mark, I got one. I have a Fordham too, and same glove as you demonstrated in your video. But when I was using that Typhoon bit, it got caught up in that glove.
Yeah, so that, yeah.
It snapped the shaft, so I don't use gloves anymore when I'm doing that.
Yeah, and Dave was good enough. I think it was Dave that corrected me on that. The photograph the photo that I used was misleading. And so although I have a Kevlar glove on, I have a leather glove over it. All right, so I have 2 layers of gloves. I wouldn't recommend you do that with a bare hand. You know that Typhoon bit, if you've used it, you know how quickly and how lightly you have to apply pressure to get the wood removed. If it touches your finger, you'll go right down to the tendons of your finger before you can blink. So if you got the Kevlar glove, definitely wear the Kevlar glove, but put a leather glove over top of it.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's. The next step is to talk about further detailing. So my detailing here started with a wood burning tool, and so although I have a number of different tips for this particular wood burning tool, this is pretty much the one I use all the time. And I think it's just the standard tip. It is it's razor thin. The side profile is razor thin, and it does the job for me for pretty much everything that I need to do from a carving standpoint. Of course, by adjusting the heat load on the end of that, you can get a very fine light line if you need it, or you can get a pretty dark valley cut into your carving if you need it. Okay, so that one does the job for me for just about everything I want to do. So if you take a look at the boot as an example, you know, you can carve a boot like this and leave it just like that, and you'll be really happy with the boot. What I did was I started adding seams. So I said, well, where would the leather lower part of the boot separate from the upper part? So I made a little bit of a pattern there and made sure that I went through with a knife here, and this was undercut up here so that this upper leather stands proud of the lower leather. What you can't see is there's another seam down here, undercut from this side, so that this front leather stands proud of the back leather. And then I did the same with the bootstrap, and the bootstrap stands proud of the whole thing. Okay, and I just went over that with the wood burning tool. And again, you just adjust the temperature to whatever temperature gives you the line that you like. It does a couple of things. It takes away any I'll call it, for lack of a better term, fuzzy sections from the wood. So if you've made a cut there and there's a little bit of a hair of grain there, and rather than trying to scrape at it with your knife or going at it with a little tiny piece of sandpaper, this wood burning tool just burns it away cleanly. So you get that advantage. The other advantage that I mentioned to you before is when you do go to paint, if you decide that this color is going to be different than this color, and you have a hand about as steady as mine and will never be able to get a line like that crisp, that valley you just burned just made a valley where the paint goes no farther than that. So when I paint this one color, if it's a wash, not a thick paint, if it's a wash, a thinned out acrylic paint, you know, you get pretty close to it with your paintbrush, and then it'll just seep in to that line, and it won't go into this line because it's gone into a bit of a valley. And then if you come back with a different color paint, you do the same thing on this side with a thinned out acrylic, a wash acrylic, it'll go no farther than that as well. And so if you do it well, if you do it with a thin enough paint, what you'll end up with is that nice crisp line, but the line will still be blackish and really looks smart. It's not only tidies up your painting, but it looks nice with that line as well. So I always go through and I do that wherever I can with the wood burning tool. Now, John, when you were talking about your face, I asked you about wood burning tool there, because I know that some carvers will wood burn around their eye, around the carving's eye. And I've done that in the past, hit and miss. Do you do that at all?
Not really, no. I might do it in the hair, but I don't do this, the cheeks or the eyes. I've done, like you said, I've done it myself before, and it doesn't always work out.
Okay, yeah. I don't do it on the face that often, but occasionally I do.
Yeah.
Okay, and so the next thing I did was just to make the boot a little bit more interesting. And again, you could leave the boot like that and be really happy with it, right? But I went to Pinterest and said, okay, what does a woman's cowboy boot look like? And they were kind of fancy. So they had these little designs on it. So I just took a little scrap piece of paper and I drew one of the designs on it. And then I cut it out broader or larger than what the pattern I wanted. And I just held it up to the carving, just like you see me doing it there. And I took a pencil and I just put a light pencil line around the paper. And that just gave me a sense of where I wanted to burn. So you can see the light pencil line in here, can't you? And I just burned inside that. And I did that 4 times per boot. And I, of course, this image is the mirror image of that. So it's the other side of that pattern, but it just made a nice little pattern there. And again, you can leave the carving just like that. And now you've got something interesting, because not only is this going to be a different color than this, but this is going to be a different color than both. And so it just makes it a little more interesting. Still with the wood burning tool, start thinking, if you want to, right? If you want to, you can start adding stitches, and the stitching is super easy. You just modify the temperature of that tip, so you're not, boring a hole into the wood, and just use the tip of the wood burning tool and just make little dots all the way down, or little dashes all the way down. You don't have to be terribly accurate. If you look at the stitching on anything, it's not terribly accurate. But again, that black little holes you're making are really going to look nice when you put that light, thin wash of an acrylic over it, because you're going to see that stitching through it. All right. So just some ideas, give those things a try. It's again, it's something that you can decide whether you want to play with that level of detail. I really enjoy it. It's my favorite part of carving, is putting this kind of detail into it and thinking of little things I can do to make it more interesting to look at. And so give those things a try. It's easy to do. You may dedicate a half an hour to it, and you might find you're going to be really pleased with that. Did the same thing with the rest of the figure. So, earlier you would have seen me enhance all of those individual frill elements with the wood burning tool. That was important, just to make sure that was, you could really clearly see that they were individual fringes. You can see I put a little pattern around her belt buckle here. That didn't pan out too well, but it was something I wanted to try. And I'll show you what I did with that a little bit later. You can see I put stitching along where the pocket lines would be, along the seam down the side, and there's stitching around the back. You'll see a little bit later. Stitching around the outside of this vest. I pictured the vest as a leather vest, and so I put a broad stitching around that. And then this is an important part that I want you to think about. And so I had mentioned to you before that in the past I had shown some beadwork on a Western carving. And so I wanted to do the same thing. And you'll see in a few slides when this is painted, this is how easy it is to do the beadwork. So I just showed the breadth of the beads, and then I just subdivided that into different sections with horizontal and vertical lines. Now, the idea again is when you go to paint that, if I want a yellow bead followed by a blue bead, I know that as soon as I put the yellow here, it's going to go no farther than that burnt valley that I just made. And when I put the blue next to it, it's not going to bleed into the yellow. It'll go no farther than that. You know, you have to be a little bit accurate with it. You're not going to do it with a 4-inch brush. But if you're careful, maybe in doing it with the end of a pin or the end of a sharpened toothpick, you'll find that it's very easy to paint something like that, and it looks marvelous when it's finished. Okay, so think about things like that when you're working on your carving. I think this is pretty much a picture of the same thing, but you can see how I use the wood burning tool that's just to enhance some of the lines, the stitching in particular, the beadwork. I gave her a little bit of a fancy cuff at the end of her shirt here. I saw it on a Pinterest site. And so kind of a Western looking cuff. I knew that the shirt was going to be different color rather than this. And then the trim work would be a different color than the rest of it. So you can see the valley lines there with the wood burning tool. Although it's going to look like when it's painted, I had a real steady hand in painting that trim line. I didn't. I had my old shaky hand, but the paint didn't go any farther than those burned lines, those valley lines. And so again, an important thing to play with, to just try. So a picture of the back. This isn't a very bright picture, but did the same thing with the beadwork at the back, made a little bit of a different pattern, but that's just a bunch of horizontal and vertical lines. You can see the pockets in, the pockets are raised from the jeans. The front of the jean is raised from the back of the jean just to make it look like there are seams there, and then the stitching. You can see I use the wood burning tool to make the belt and the loops really stand out as well, okay? I should mention in this picture too, a number of people have talked about a concern about, do you see the seam line when you've glued the arm onto the body? You really don't. So, those dark lines you see there is really the glue between the two. There's a little bit of glue there. But if you saw any line in there at all, it's really not more than the line you'd see in a shirt anyway, between the sleeve and the back of the shoulder. So, you can do a really good job with that notion of using your graphite or lead or whatever you're using to mark one against the other, and then taking away the high spots. Okay, this is a lousy picture, but this is the brim of the hat. Now, I put my finger over it, so you really can't tell what it is. But what I wanted to show you is that I wanted to put some beads in here, and I wanted some long beads as well. And so around the front of the hat, I just used the wood burning tool to make, 2 long beads. There's one long bead and another one underneath it. I used a nail punch. So just a nail punch from the workshop, and I just held it in my hands and put enough pressure on it to make a depression in the hat where I wanted those beads. And this is just the top of I think it's a big pen type of thing. I said, okay, that's about the size of the one I want in the middle, and I just used that to push in there as well. So now I had a contour that I'd come back and paint a little later. Now, John, you made a good point to me about wetting that.
Yeah, damping the wood a little bit would help the impression. It would That's how they do backs of chairs and stuff. That's how they steam it and get it ready, and then they put that press that picture inside on the back of the chair.
Yeah, good. Yeah, that was a good thought. I'm going to try that next time.
Yeah.
Okay, so the same thing. So I've come back with the wood burning tool, and I've just I've burnt in the top and the bottom of that band. But now you can see those depressions that John was just talking about. And when I come back and paint those, it'll be easier to paint a round circle now, because when I put the color in there, it's not going to really go much further than that depression I made just by crushing in the center punch. Okay. So no big secret there. Okay, and then that's what it looked like at that point in time. So you can see it's looking pretty nice. The wood burning is kind of enhanced the detail that you want to add to it. The stitching, if you're able now to paint that without covering that black stitching, that's really going to look smart everywhere in the pants and the boots. I'll get you to look right here at something. I don't think I have a better picture of that. If I do, I'll mention it again. But you can see a bunch of black right in here at the top of the boot. We've talked about how difficult sometimes it is when the grain is going in the direction of this leg, and you're trying to cut the inside of this boot down into it and cut the leg down into it. You sharpen your knife like mad, but you still seem to leave some fuzzy kind of spots down in here. And you could go at it with sandpaper if you wanted to. What I often do is I just take my wood burning tool and I just burn that. And I just scrape along it just lightly. And that takes away the little fuzzy pieces. Now, you got to be careful of that. If in fact, you're planning to do this pair of jeans very, very light colored, you might see the black through. But if you know that you're going to do it dark enough blue that you're going to cover that black, you can get away with this. But I find that as an easy way to make a nice smooth spot in a spot that was really hard to cut in just because of the grain of the wood ended up in kind of a wedge. If you follow what I'm saying there. Okay, then I started painting. And so unlike John, I tend to paint with acrylic paints on the face. I'll start with a flesh colored acrylic paint, and I'll add browns and reds to it to darken it. So if I'm doing a cowhand, a male cowboy, and he needs to have a ruddy, weathered face, I'll take that flesh color and I'll really darken it with brown and with red. And you have to add both, and you have to keep looking at it. Is this sort of the right level that I want in terms of the color of the face? For this girl, I wanted her to look very pale and very pleasant and very, very female, like a real country singer with makeup on the stage and the whole 9 yards. And so this was pretty much just right out of the bottle flesh paint. Now it was thinned down. It wasn't one coat. One coat would have been too heavy, but it was several coats put on. Started just as John does with the eyes, the whites of the eyes. I didn't darken the eyes. Sometimes I'll add a little bit of yellow to the eyes just so that it's not appliance white. With her, I wanted her smile and her eyes to be completely white. Gave her big blue eyes, great big pupils. Gave her mascara here that was very, very stylish, like you'd expect from a performer. The hair I did in a number of different colors. So I used mostly what would be a yellow ochre, but I would have put the yellow ochre on first and then put a few washes of a darker brown on it. And the darker brown would then seep into the valleys between the strands of hair and give it a little bit more contour like you see here. And then when that was dry, I would have finished up with a whitish yellow dry brush. So I would have just taken it right out of the bottle, put it on a brush, a fairly broad brush. I would have, with a paper towel, taken away most of that paint and then just fanned across the whole thing. And although the photograph here isn't picking a lot of it up, you can see here where it's highlighted very, very light. And you see that throughout her hair all the way around. So between the darker valleys, the sort of yellow ochre tops of the strands of hair, and then the very tips with this yellow white. It made a nice effect, I think. The hat would have been a beige color. I tend to use a beige color. It's called linen, and I find that's a nice beige color for clothing in particular. And so that's got a linen on it. It has different colors in it because I would have taken a wash of yellow ochre and I would have gone over that linen with one wash of yellow ochre. Now, Lloyd asked earlier, how thin is a wash? And John answered it really well. I thought, it's as thin as you want it. And if it doesn't come out well enough, put another coat on, right? I have seen people say that you put 1 drop of paint for 30 drops of water. I would say that is too wet for me. That is nowhere near what I would use. It works very well for other carvers. Mine has more opacity than that, so there's more paint in it than 1 drop of paint per 30 drops of water. But this yellow ochre would have been very thin. I would have put that on. I dry it with the hair dryer so that it dries in seconds, and then if I don't like it, if I want a little darker, I put another coat on. All right. Up in here where there's the dimple of the crown of the hat, I would have put a little bit more of that yellow ochre up in here and let that dry in both these valleys just to give it a nice contour. You can see I added all of the beads here, different color beads, the little emerald here. This color brown is a brown that Lynn Doughty recommends, and I'm glad he did recommend it because I think it's probably the nicest brown in the spectrum of browns. It's called asphaltum. So it's like asphalt, A-S-P-H-A-L-T-U-M. So it's A-S-P-H-A-L-T-U-M, asphaltum. Very, very nice color. You'll see it again when I've done the boots. It does a beautiful job on anything that you want to do from a leather standpoint. I think one of the nicest browns. So here's another view of the same thing. You can see that really nice brown. You can see, I hope you can see that after I did the yellow ochre here, I would have gone over it with even a lighter beige than the hat. And that would have been, again, dry brushed. So I would have put it on, right out of the bottle on a fan type, they actually call it a mop brush, an artist's mop brush. I would have put it on this mop brush and then removed pretty much all of the paint from the brush, to the point that if I was able to fan my hand, the back of my hand with this brush, nothing would show up. But when you put it on the paint and you fan over that, you get these tiny little highlights, and you can just barely see them in this picture. You can get tiny little highlights, and it just gives another dimension again to the carving. So you have the linen primary color, you have the yellow ochre that's floating in some of these little valleys that you chipped out, and now you have this dry brushed, very light beige, almost white on top of it. And it just gives more depth to the whole carving. Okay. One of the things that I always do, I didn't do in this carving, but I got to go back to it, is I'll use a little 5-minute epoxy, and I'll put some 5-minute epoxy in the eye. And the reason for doing that is it really glosses that up and it makes it look like an eyeball. Some people just put the 5-minute epoxy over the pupil. I tend to put it over the whole eye. If you decide to do that, recognize a couple things. It only takes a tiny bit of 5-minute epoxy to put in there. It spreads. If you put too much in it, it'll look like your eyes are watering. You'll get a puddle of it under your eyes. So just put a little bit of it in. The other thing is you got to move pretty quickly. You don't want the 5-minute epoxy to get tacky, or else you'll be trying to move it around and you'll just be making little spikes in the 5-minute epoxy. So you got to move fairly quickly with it. Okay. So this is racing ahead here, and the next few slides just show a variety of different pictures of the different sections of the carving, and we'll talk about how they were painted. One of the reasons why I wanted to show you this picture is for this reason here. That's as fancy as my painting gets. So I don't have any phenomenal pieces of equipment. I have some nice paint brushes. I have a margarine dish that I didn't throw out in the recycling, and I fill it full of water. and I flip the lid over and I do all my mixing on something like this, just the inside lid of the margarine dish. And you really don't need anything more than that. Some people will take a piece of safety glass and they'll have a piece of safety glass down and they'll put a white sheet underneath the safety glass and they do all their mixing on the glass. Really good idea as well. But you don't need a whole lot of preparation to do a good job of painting. Okay. Are there any questions at all, guys?
Mark, what's the make and model of wood burner that you use?
It is razor tip. It's a razor tip. It's called an SSD10. It has two wands that come with it. And so you can switch between the two. I only use the one wand, and there is a razor tip that just has the one wand. I'd recommend that. That works great.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. This next piece I wanted to talk to you a little bit about was that belt buckle. And so you might remember that I talked to you about the use of aluminum tape. And so this is aluminum tape that you'd use in HVAC applications. It comes in a roll of silver tape. It is aluminum. It has an adhesive back to it. And it's a really strong adhesive. And so, I wanted this belt buckle to look metal. So I cut out a piece. I put it over the piece of wood that was the belt buckle, of course. And then I just rubbed it on. I burnished it on with the back of my fingernail, really. And it seals really well in that fashion. From there, I just trimmed around the edge here. And I just kind of, with my fingernail again, just pushed into the ridge that I had carved into the belt buckle. And then at the very end, I added a wash of Payne's Gray. Now, Payne's Gray is a color. It's called Payne's Gray. It's spelled P-A-Y-N-E. It gives things kind of a gunmetal gray look. I think I mentioned at the last time we talked that where John adds darkness, black to a face, I tend to add Payne's Gray. And it does the same thing. But you can see here between these two pictures, that would have been too shiny for a belt buckle. And then that would have been, that's kind of what you're looking for. Okay. I'm just going to get everybody to check their mute buttons and make sure they're muted because I'm getting a little static from behind here. Okay. The next piece was I had worked on that violin, and this is what I started with in terms of again, it's a maple and it's got the wood burning all done in it. And so I just used a red mahogany stain and I stained that full violin. And then I came back and just as John adds acrylic paint to an oiled paint stain, I added yellows and a little bit of red in sort of center section here and just blended it all in. And I just used washes, and as John stated earlier, if you didn't get enough on the first time, put another one on or a third one on. And I just kept doing that until I could see a nice transition from like a red to an orange to a nice yellowy look here. Kind of gave it a violin look. I added black, just black acrylic paint to the spots on the violin that are black. And then it was time to add strings. So the strings ended up being speaker wire. So I just had some stranded speaker wire, and I just took one of the strands. I twisted one end of this end, and I twisted this end of the strands. So those four strands or strings are together. I took a gouge and made a little hole in the end here. I planted that stranded end into the end and epoxied it in place, just 5-minute epoxy again. Okay. The tape did two things. The tape kept the four strands apart while the epoxy was drying. I didn't want it just to look like a clump. And it also kept the strings from here to here in the straight line that I wanted them to be eventually. Then the other end, I did exactly the same thing. I carved where can I show you here? I carved out this section, just the center section here. I stuck that stranded section in there, and then I epoxied it in place. I'm showing this picture. This isn't high tech, but use clothespins. Like I find for the size of carving that we're doing, if you ever have to glue anything, clothespins are the best clamp that I can find. They give you the enough pressure that that you're going to need for clamping the glue, but they don't mar the rest of the carving. They're not so so much force that they're going to leave an impression in the rest of the carving. And so that's the way the violin ended up. And you know, it looked pretty good. So this is epoxy down in here in a valley. This is epoxy here. Then I epoxied along here as well. And you know, when I pulled these strings down to epoxy here, that's where the clothespin was the clamp to keep those strings nice and tight. Okay, folks. All right, so back to painting the rest of the, you can see here again, the hat with the linen base, the yellow ochre wash, and now you can see a little bit better that dry brushing on the top of almost a white beige. You can see that asphaltum brown here and the nice colors in here of the little emblems. You can see a little bit better the darker section of the hair, the brighter on the top, and then that dry brushing real bright on the top of it all. Okay. Here you're able to see what those the start, at least one picture of what those beads looked like. So again, you know, it wasn't anything clever in terms of painting. It was just putting the dots, the colors you wanted in those little squares that you burned, knowing that the paint wasn't going to go any farther than those squares. Okay, here's a better picture of it. So it turned out pretty nice, those little squares. All right. You can see here I added a little white to the eyes. Never done that before. I think, John, you suggested that to me. So I added a little white there, and it kind of came out nice for a female, I thought. Here also you can see that all the little buttons here, those are just the end of pins, just little straight pins. And so what I would have done is I would have taken the full pin and I would just, first I would have marked lightly with a pencil where I wanted each of the buttonholes. With the pin, I would have just driven a pin into the side of the wood, maybe 1/8 of an inch. And then I just cut off the head, leaving maybe about 1/8 of an inch of the stem of the pin and shoved it in place. Occasionally, I'll put a little dab of epoxy on it before I shove it in place. But the truth is you'd have to pick pretty hard to get that safe, to get that straight pin out. You can see here again how nice that those beads look. You know, very simple to do, and it really enhances your carving if you want to take the time to give it a try and do that. Also notice here that this vest was done to look like leather. I find that the best way to make leather look like leather is to use yellow ochre. And so this is a wash of yellow ochre, followed by a wash of burnt sienna, which is a brown, or a wash of asphaltum, that other brown. And you just alternate the washes until you get the look you want. You'll see a little bit later in some of the pictures here that you can put in a little bit more of the brown where the valleys of the vest is going to be, or the valleys of the clothing is going to be, and it just gives it a little bit more contour. Again, doing the kerchief here, there's more than one color of red in there. I think there's about 3 colors of red in there. So there's a darker red in the valleys, a little lighter red midway, and then a very light red on the very peaks of these contours. And that, again, it just helps trick your eye into seeing that this is very 3-dimensional. You know, if you want to play with it, add a little pattern. The pattern doesn't have to be complicated. I just used a few different little colors on the end of the, you know, I think I just sharpened a piece of wood like a toothpick and just dabbed, you know, the right out of the bottle, the color I wanted, and just dabbed it on and made the same little pattern. Recognize when you do that, you don't want the pattern going straight across like this, because the kerchief has a pattern, but you've got a knot in it and it's all folded. So it's going to be all over the place. So you you have artistic license to put these little patterns anywhere you want, and no one's going to argue with you. That's just the way that the material is folded. Again, you can see here that the shirt that I did in a turquoise, and it's hard to see in this, but you might see it a little bit here, certainly inside this elbow, underneath the arm here, within this wrinkle, it's a little bit darker. And so all I did was, when I painted this with, again, thin colors, thin washes, maybe several washes, I then put a little extra blue in the turquoise. You could have put a little extra green in the turquoise, anything that would have darkened it, and that went under the arms, that went within the valleys of the wrinkles, it went underneath the vest here to just give it a different tone. Okay, so keep that in mind. You can see here that, again, you know, you or I would not have been able to paint that black line as nicely as that is without having first burned it in. It would have been shaky. It would have been it would have been broader in some areas and narrow in others, but that burning just really makes those valleys for you, allows you to do that kind of thing. Now, the vest, again, you can see the vest in this area where the contour, where you wanted to enhance the contour, there's a little bit more brown in there as wash. There's a little bit more brown in sections here of the fringe. When I finished doing that, I went with the dry brushing again. You can see the dry brushing. It's a light beige. Typically, you use dry brushing like that as a final step to make the clothes look a little worn or dusty or dirty. I didn't want it to look worn or dusty or dirty, but I knew that just a little hint of that dry brushing on the highest spots would just give it more character and more depth in the painting. Okay. You can see here, maybe this is the first picture, you can see where this asphaltum is. Dry brushing that, you can see the light lines there on the high points of the carving. And again, it just gives it a little bit more interest.
Question, what's brand name is that asphaltum?
It is called Folk Art. And I got it at Michael's, Dave.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. It's a nice paint. Here you can see the dry brushing again. You can see on her rear end here where the jeans would be worn after putting the blue jean color on, which was called Midnight Blue, a number of washes, light enough so that you could continually see that stitching. I then came back and with just a little bit of white and just a tiny bit of blue on right out of the bottle on a paintbrush, I just kind of almost scrubbed this into this area to give it a lighter color, like it's worn. These little pins are, again, the ends of straight pins, put them in exactly the same way. I wanted them to look brass, like a brass rivet on a jean, so I came back and just touched that with a paint called Worn Penny. What can I show you on this? I think we've talked about everything. You can see a little bit of that darker in the wrinkles here. You can see this section of her thighs is worn. You can see that the wash was light enough that allowed me to continue to see all the stitching. I didn't want to hide that stitching. This is a better shot of that worn section in here. The knees are a little bit worn, followed up by dry brushing everywhere. Same thing there. Think of the little details like this. This bow as an example. The bow is not just brown; it's brown on the back, and it's horsehair on the front. And it's usually a very light color. And so I made sure that when I made this bow, I had a line going up, that wood burned line going up here, so I'd be able to differentiate and not run one color into the other. Same thing. You can see the nice effect of dry brushing up here over that asphaltum. And then I made the base. And so I created a base, and you recall what John said, it's really important to kind of look at the total dimensions of the carving. I made this base and I looked at it and I said, I like the height of that base, but it's too big. There's too much negative space in here where it looks like something should go here. It looks like something should go there. So I made a smaller base. I put this one aside for another carving, and I made now a smaller base. Now, when I made this base, I took my knife and I made little planks in it, okay? And I made random plank starts and ends. This one doesn't have one at all, one here. And then I took my wood burner and I made those knife cuts a little bit deeper and a little more pronounced. But the thing I wanted to talk to you about is don't leave it that way. Like if you're making a wood plank floor, now give the floor a little bit of contour. Like your floor is going to be worn, right? So if you take a look at this here, you can imagine this is flat right across. But I took a gouge and made sure that this section was lower. So now this board is warped down this way and this one isn't. You know, similar, you can look at similarly here, one edge is warped down, this one's flat, this edge is warped down, this edge is flat. So have fun with that. That's what it looks like with different lighting. So it was pretty severe, really. And then I added paint to that to end up with this. You can see little holes here. I just used that nail punch again to make little nail holes. Added a little bit of paint in here. When I paint brown on things, including the boots, there's 3 browns that I use. One is asphaltum, the other is burnt sienna, and the other is raw sienna. The burnt sienna is really nice if you want to add a little redness to things. So I just add, you know, here and there, just different little things here to make this look like it was a worn country planks. We're coming to the end here if you're getting tired of this. So this is a picture of the boot. You can see asphaltum down here, and that's just washes of asphaltum. And you can see why it's such a preferred color. It's on its own, it's given all kinds of different tones, different hues. This is a little bit of asphaltum with yellow ochre in it, number of different washes. And this is asphaltum with a little bit of burnt sienna in it, which has a little bit of a reddish tinge. But you can see how pretty that ends up looking, right? Very little effort. They're all very thin washes. You can still see the stitching. I took this picture. You remember that I screwed up this toe and I ended up adding another little piece of wood there. Where you can see you can't see any of that. So, you know, just reinforce the idea. Don't be afraid to add a little bit of wood to something that you want to improve on your carving. Okay, and that's the way it ended up. So that's what she looks like right now. She's in the living room. So if you ever drop by and you want to see it, knock on the door and you can visit with her. Okay. All right. So I hope you enjoyed that. What we're going to do is switch to tips, chips, and tricks. And John, you got a couple things here that you wanted to mention.
Yeah. Carving the hair. On the left-hand side, I see a lot of this, just very straight lines, really thin carving. So I just wanted to show you how I do it. I carve on the right-hand side. It's more detailed. It's each side of that. I carve one side of that, say one side of the hair, but I'll make a V cut on both sides, and I'll make it so it looks like it's curly hair. So I'll dig in a little bit, say like yeah, inside there I'll double cut that, and on the bottom of it I'll notch out the very bottom of the hair, the mustache, so it looks like individual hairs. I do that a lot. I personally like more clumpy hair instead of all the individual hairs. So I'll do little bunches of hairs, like on the top of the head. See, on the left-hand side, on the top of the head, you can't see any level of hair. You only see one side of the hair. On the right-hand side, you can see there's I lower that first strand of hair, and then the next is a little bit taller than the first one, and then the third one. So you get some level of hair. It gives you more definition. And the side too, the side thing, the first strand of hair is lighter or smaller than the second strand of hair. And the eyebrows, the same thing. So that's how I do hair. And there's a couple more pictures there.
Yeah, I got one other one here.
Yeah, same idea. say if you do one strand of hair, both sides of that strand you cut into. So so it looks like it's one big individual. And at the bottom of the mustache, you individually cut into each bottom. So it looks like a little tip there. And it looks pretty cool. And at the top of the hair, same idea. I always do it in bunches instead of little hairs. Looks, I think it looks pretty neat.
It looks great.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, John. Does anybody else want to share any tips or techniques before we sign off? Okay, well, I think we've used up our time again. So I hope that was interesting to you. Give all those things a try. You know, John and I are kind of interested in seeing what you're making of this. So if you give these things a try, show us your attempts at them next time, and we can talk a little bit about it. We certainly in later the summer, early fall, we'd like to have another little virtual show of our carving. So start thinking about that. Start working on a little carving that you'd like to offer up as an entry to that show. And hopefully that incorporates some of the things that we've talked about as a group here. Okay.
Yep.
So thank you for joining us. Have a great night. And for all of the fathers and grandfathers, have a happy Father's Day. I hope you all get spoiled.